Hi everyone, thanks for joining us today for this NEO Group webinar on third-party oversight. I'm Laurence Blanchette, the Marketing Manager here at NEO Group, and I'll be behind the scenes for most of today's session. Before we get started, I have a few quick points to cover. First, let's see if we can make this session as engaging and interactive as possible. I encourage everyone to ask questions and share comments throughout the presentation using the questions panel. We'll do our best to address these as we go along, and we also have some time set aside at the end of the presentation specifically for Q&A. Also, the session is being recorded. I'll share the recording and the slide deck with you via email soon after the session. If you're joining us for the first time, this next slide gives you a little bit of background on NEO Group. NEO is recognized globally as a leading supply and outsourcing analytics, monitoring, and advisory firm. We help clients like Northern Trust, Disney, Microsoft, and others achieve business objectives and address business challenges by leveraging global services and outsourcing. Thanks again for joining us today. Without further delay, it's my pleasure to introduce today's presenter, Christine Ferrusi Ross, Partner and Senior Vice President here at NEO Group. Over to you, Christine.
Thanks, Laurence. And just to echo what Laurence said, I really appreciate all of you joining and spending your morning and your afternoon with me to talk about the three components of an effective third-party risk oversight program. Those of you that I've spoken to before know that this is an important topic for me personally and for NEO, as we really think that this is going to be the next differentiator for world-class companies in terms of how they manage their suppliers and specifically how they manage their supplier risk. So I'd like to actually start there and just bring that out up front. Most of you, I think, probably already are starting to think about this because you've joined the call, but I know that a lot of you get questions internally from people in your organization about why should you even bother, right? If you have a really good contract with your supplier, aren't you covered? But actually, supplier risk is something that goes far beyond your contract with the supplier. There's an expanding global sourcing footprint, and that increases your risk, right? So think about all of the different locations where your suppliers are and all the different risks that can come from those locations. So even if your supplier specifically is considered a very stable player, sometimes where they're delivering services from can have an impact on you. So that global footprint really has a lot to do with why you'd worry about this. There's higher exposure for your firm, particularly for those of you who operate in regulated industries, but actually for all of us, there are a lot of partners in a lot of different countries where you can source from, and there's a lot of exposure related to those issues. If you think about the regulations in your industry, think about all the different hacker attacks that have happened in the past year or so. Many of them came in through supplier credentials, right? So it's not just that something might happen to your supplier. There's actually a pretty decent risk to you and your customer data, your operational data, based on things that your supplier might have access to. So there's a high exposure for you. And that can have a lot of impact on your operations. So those low-cost locations that we were talking about, they can have a lot of issues, economic issues, they can have political issues, they can have natural disaster issues, right? Things about like floods and typhoons and earthquakes and a lot of things that might have to cause your supplier to disrupt its service to you in one way or another, at least temporarily. So operations impact to you can be pretty serious. But monitoring really provides an opportunity to take proactive measures, and we're going to talk a lot about that actually. So as you're thinking through this presentation with me, I really want you to think about supplier risk not just as something to protect you from bad things, but really good supplier risk is actually a way for you to be smarter and be more proactive and take advantage of opportunities that you hadn't before. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. So really quickly, I want to show you what a process for vendor risk management might look like. And then I'm going to take you through some of these steps in more detail. So you really have to start, at the very beginning, which is sort of the top of the clock here. What risks matter? Right? What kinds of things should worry you? and I'm going to talk about that in more detail. You need to assign responsibility for tracking and taking action on those risks. We'll talk about that. Deciding what the risk indicators are. So, for example, most of us would have a sense of if our suppliers started having quarter after quarter of bad revenues, that something might not be right there. But normally that's not a specific enough risk indicator to do something about. So you need to have very specific risk indicators that you know in advance what you're looking for. So when that actually happens, you're not sort of looking around thinking, all right, should I take action on this or should I not? You'll know because you've created specific risk indicators that you're looking for that lead to your action plan, which is the next step. So an action plan is a really nice way of saying that if something actually happens, you know what you're going to do about it. And I'll actually talk to you in more detail about how to create the action plan. Then you have to track all that data, because of course once you build this process, if you don't have the data ongoing, the process is pretty static and it's not going to do you any good. So it's actually access to the data to be able to track all these indicators that will help you decide. And then if you see something that's trending either up or down, your risk is either increasing or decreasing, to take an action based on your action plan. And we'll talk more details there. And then the feedback loop, right? So having gone through this a couple of times and having seen some particular events that maybe you took action on, what do you need to do differently or not differently, or the same that you can incorporate to make a better process so that you're constantly learning from the events that are happening. So as I take you through that as a formal agenda, we're going to define supplier-related risks, right? And again, keep in mind it's not necessarily just risks that happen to the supplier, but risks that would specifically affect you. How you can monitor your suppliers and their geographic locations, again, because you can't really separate the supplier from where they operate. How to build an actionable risk management program, because if you don't actually take any action based on what you're seeing, then all you're doing is collecting data for no real purpose because it won't help you. So the action plan is a really critical piece of this whole puzzle. And then using third-party oversight to take advantage of new business opportunities. Again, it's nice if you can protect yourself using supplier risk management, but we really think that the opportunity is to achieve greater things because you actually have the supplier risk management program. So we're going to talk about that. So before we start, I will address the elephant in the room, and this is the question I get all the time when I talk to clients, right? Which is, Christine, I don't know how you want me to do this. I don't have enough resources. I don't have enough resources for everybody to do the jobs that they've been assigned. Now you're telling me supplier risk management is important, but it's like pulling a loose thread. You start and you think that, it's just this little piece, and once you clean it up, it's fine. But in fact, next thing you know, everything's unraveling, right? Because, okay, maybe I've only got 10 suppliers, Christine, but those 10 suppliers have subcontractors that I have to worry about because they're part of the supply chain, and they're all in these different locations, and they all have different risk factors that I'm trying to address. So that loose thread keeps getting longer and longer, and I don't have the resources. So knowing that nobody has all of the resources that we need to do this the way that we'd like, as you're listening to the presentation and you're thinking about your limited resources, I want you to think about two pieces: the process itself and the action steps, right? So what are the things you actually need to do, right, as opposed to trying to kind of boil the ocean? And then I want you to think about specifically your key suppliers and locations, right? So as you're going through this, keep in mind that you're really trying to track the suppliers that could harm you, right? So if, for example, you've got, a laptop vendor, there are plenty of laptop vendors, right? So if your laptop vendor goes out of business for some reason, the chances are there's really not going to be much of a hiccup for you to pick a different supplier because laptops are commodities. It's not that difficult of an operation to do. If the outsourcer who's running all of your infrastructure operations goes down and you can't operate your business because your data center is out, that's a very different kind of a problem. So when you're thinking about supplier risk, don't treat all suppliers and all risks equally. Really think about the risks that will impact you the most. So let's actually talk about that definition because this is an important place to get started. Whenever you say, are you worried about supplier risk? Inevitably, everybody will say yes. I've never actually really had somebody say no outright. They might say not really, but for the most part, everybody's concerned about this, right? We've seen the hacker attacks. We've seen it in the news that they came in through their suppliers. We've seen suppliers that have gone out of business, big stable suppliers that we thought were, in pretty good spaces, players who are in geographies that get hurt by natural disasters and now can't operate for us. So given that supplier risk is such a big space, you really have to answer a little bit of a more specific question, like what are you really worried about in this environment, right? So it's not just supplier risk. You're actually probably worried about a business-related issue. So the four most common things that you are probably worried about are that the supplier can't deliver what was promised to you. So you have a contract that says the supplier is going to do something, and you're really only worried about risk that the supplier can't deliver on that, right? That other things may happen to the supplier, but as long as they're delivering to you, that's really your key risk that you're worried about. Others of you might be worried much more about compliance, right? What if the supplier does something or doesn't do something that causes you to be non-compliant with legal requirements or regulatory requirements? That's a big one, particularly for those of you in highly regulated industries, but I know that a lot of other clients have told me that's a big concern for them, right? Nobody wants to be non-compliant. There are all kinds of bad things that happen if you're non-compliant. So if that non-compliance happens because of a supplier, it could be a big deal for you. The third thing we hear a lot is that the supplier does something that reflects badly on you and harms your brand. Sometimes these things can seem harmless, and sometimes they can't. There was a case I recall a few years ago where an email database management company got hacked, and they managed the email lists for pharmaceutical companies and hotel chains and really big brand companies. And most clients of those firms were shocked. They didn't know that if they gave their email address to the hotel, it was actually sitting in a third party's database and data center. They thought they gave it to the hotel. They didn't even know that this outsourcer was involved. Now, it turned out, again, from a pure security standpoint, it wasn't that big a deal, but there was a brand issue associated there. There was a brand hit that hotel chain and that the pharmaceutical company took because a lot of people who gave their emails to these companies didn't realize that the company wasn't holding on to that themselves. So that can harm the brand even if nothing else actually happens because of that. And then another one that's much more tactical but certainly important to a lot of you is that I won't get a good deal in my next negotiation with my supplier. If I don't know what they're facing and what kind of situation they're in, I may not be able to get the best negotiation. I may not be asking the right questions, and I may get a deal that is suboptimal because there were pieces that I should have accounted for that I didn't in that negotiation. So with that, I'm actually going to ask all of you to think about that question and ask you, what's your primary reason to monitor and manage risks in your services supply chain? So I'm going to open this poll and give you about 30 seconds or so to answer it. So again, the question is, what is your primary reason to monitor and manage the risks in your services supply chain? Avoiding service disruptions, ensuring compliance, protecting your brand, or informing contract renegotiations? And I'll just give you another 15 seconds or so to answer that. Okay. So interesting, if you can see the data on your screens right now, you'll see that of those of you who responded, and most of you did, thank you, 61% are worried about ensuring compliance, 28% are worried about service disruptions, and 11% are worried about protecting the brand, and no one actually picked informing contract renegotiations, which I suppose since this is January, it actually makes sense. That option tends to rank a little bit higher in November and December as a lot of renegotiations come up. But this shows that you've got a lot of the same challenges that the other clients that I talk to have, right? Which is that you know that your supplier has the ability to harm you potentially because of non-compliance or because of services disruption. So let's actually talk about how you can protect yourself through better supplier risk management and third-party oversight. So a risk obviously is just the chance that you could be harmed, right? The risk is normally defined, and for those of you who haven't yet, it's actually worthwhile to talk to your chief compliance officer or your risk and compliance team that you might have, right? Probably as part of your legal department or part of your finance department. But the risk is actually something that happens to you as a client, right? You're thinking about, the risk that you can't operate or the risk that you're harmed somehow by something that happens to the supplier. That's different than a trigger event, which is the actual occurrence that causes the risk to happen. So if, for example, you're worried about the risk of supplier disruption, from one of your suppliers, say in Thailand, that's supplying hardware parts for you, if there's a typhoon there, the typhoon's the trigger event that causes the disruption risk. So a little nitpicky, but it's actually worthwhile, particularly as you're trying to get a handle on this. You want to make sure that you're using the same language that your risk team does so that you're not crossing wires and everybody is looking at the problem the same way. And defining risks means going back to what you're really worried about. We talked about that, right, with the risk that your supplier suddenly can't deliver the compliance and the questions we were just talking about. But to be effective, you actually need a definition of each risk type and what events could cause that risk to increase or decrease, right? So once you know what risks you're concerned about, right, and you can track those only if you know what events might cause that risk to happen. So again, if you're worried about service disruption, there can be a set of risks that, set of trigger events that you might be looking for to see if that event will happen, and that's how you can think about tracking, right? So you have a definition of a risk type, and you track the kinds of events that could cause that risk to happen, and that's what you're monitoring. You're monitoring those events to see if they're increasing, decreasing, and what kind of impact they're having on the risk type. So as an example, let me show you some sample risk categories. So the risk, if you think about your suppliers, what's the risk that your provider is financially unstable, right? So that's the first category, financial risk. Okay. And financial risk, again, is one because most often that implies that the supplier won't be able to deliver to you for one reason or another. So even though financial risk might be the category, the things that you're looking for are what kind of investments are they making? What does their balance sheet look like? What's their liquidity? What's their profitability? You can read here. What does their cash flow look like, right? So those are the specific metrics and events that you're tracking against this category called financial risk. And here, this is actually when NEO tracks supplier risk. These are the categories that we look at to determine whether or not a supplier is risky or not. So financial risk, services risk, governance risk, people risk, infrastructure, clients, partners, and thought leadership. And you will get these slides and a copy of the webinar recording afterwards. So I hope that you are, of course, paying attention and taking notes, but if you miss something on this slide, don't worry about it. You will get it afterwards, so you'll have it for your own reference. Okay. So I said this before, but I want to come back to this slide that I showed you earlier because supplier risk really requires location context, right? And again, what that means is that you could be working with an incredibly stable player if you were looking at some of those issues like financial risk and how good are they at the service that you've hired them to do for you and those kinds of things. But sometimes they're in a location that might require some extra risk. One thing that happened last year that a lot of my clients were concerned about was the situation in Ukraine, where I know a lot of clients use some application development resources, right? It's becoming a nearshore and offshore hub for a lot of companies who want to do application development. So in and of itself, a lot of good players over there and even some bigger players who have operations in Ukraine. But if you weren't tracking Ukraine as a location and you were only tracking your supplier, you wouldn't have caught that there were insurgencies that were coming and the issue with Russia and the eventual Russian troops kind of rolling into parts of Ukraine you wouldn't have caught that if you were just tracking the supplier. So that's why it's really important to track the location that your supplier is delivering from, as well as the supplier itself, because if you track one but not the other, you're going to miss some important pieces of data. So I showed you some examples of risk categories for suppliers, and this is a similar thing, but this is for locations. So again, when NEO tracks risks for locations, this is what we are tracking. So we think about macroeconomic risk, and this is all the things that you might think about. What's the GDP, or is the economy growing? What's the inflation rate? What's the credit risk of that particular economy? Financial risk. These are actually more about what's the financial risk of somebody doing business there, right? So what are the labor costs for your supplier that they might be facing? What kind of financial environment would your supplier be in, and how would that then kind of roll down to you, right, in terms of the costs that they face? Geopolitical, I think we just talked about that with Ukraine. Natural disasters also falls into that. Again, think about earthquakes, think about the tornadoes and floods that have been happening recently. Infrastructure risk, business risk, legal risk, scalability, and quality of life. This is one that many of us wouldn't necessarily think about, but certainly as you think about your corporate social responsibility, and I know that many of you worry about not just the work getting delivered to you, but what kind of suppliers are you hiring? If you check on the quality of life risk for geography, it gives you a sense of, what's the likelihood that your supplier might be using something considered, modern-day slave labor? What's the chances of poor working conditions, right? So if you think about this, again, in context of your broader corporate risk program and making sure that your supply chain, either for products or services, is free from not just compliance issues, but moral issues and ethical issues. As you're thinking about this, these are the kinds of things that you could track to make sure that not only are you getting a good deal, not only is your supplier stable for you, but that your supplier is not doing something that will harm you, either even directly like that, but even indirectly, right? If you remember the fire in Bangladesh, which was just about a year ago now, even 5 years ago, most of us wouldn't know where our clothes were made. I mean, it has the tag that says, right, it's made in China, it's made in Bangladesh, wherever it's made, but we wouldn't know about the conditions of workers there. We wouldn't know about factory fires. And now with, the global news chain, we do know those things. There's a lot more visibility into which suppliers you use and what kinds of suppliers are they? Are they ethical or not? And those things can come back at you, right? Not because you've done anything, but because you use child labor, you use, unsafe working conditions. So don't underestimate the importance of being able to track the things like quality of life, even though, again, from a normal business due diligence, maybe you wouldn't track that, but it's important when you're thinking about your suppliers here. So this is the model that NEO uses, and it's a sample just to show you how you can put everything together, right? So you're tracking a lot of different things, and not all risks are equal. Remember that I told you that earlier. So what you would do is you would actually assign a weight to the key supplier risks and location risks. NEO tracks cities and countries separately because even within one country, sometimes different cities have different risk factors that our clients want to know about. And then once you assign weights, your risk profile for your supplier and for that supplier's location will become apparent to you, right? So if you just sort of throw all the data into, say, an Excel file or some kind of database, or if you've got a risk software tool and you don't assign weights, you may get a very misleading picture about how risky a supplier or a city or a location could be. So it's important to, again, think about this very strategically. What are the most important risks that you're worried about? You may not be worried about the financial risk for, say, a consultant that's working on site with you for 3 months and then is going to go away. You'd worry about financial risk of your supplier a lot for an outsourcer that you're about to sign a 5-year outsourcing deal with. So as you're thinking about prioritizing these risks, that's the kind of prioritization you need to put against these things so that you can have a coherent picture, and that as you're seeing the different trigger events happen, you're not sending everybody into a frenzy because of some trigger event that in fact actually in the grand scheme of things isn't going to affect your risk, your overall risk profile that much. So just a way to make it a little bit more practical and easier for you to manage as you're taking in data. It'll give you a better sense of whether or not you need to worry about something because you'll know how important that risk is to you because you've assigned some risks there. Okay. As difficult as it may sound to create the risk definitions and then assigning the weights so that you can come up with the risk model, it is still generally a one-time project, right? It probably will take you several months, maybe even years, depending on how many resources you can deploy and how continuously you can work on it. But really, once it's done, then you're tweaking it based on your feedback loop, right? So in fact, that whole risk definition piece, while not the easiest thing to do, does have, generally speaking, sort of a start and an end date. What doesn't have a start and an end date is monitoring and inputs of all those data points that you need to collect, right? You need the heavy lifting that comes in here for monitoring over and over again. And again, this is where most of my clients tell me this is where the resource constraint really comes in, right? Because most of you don't really have a head count that you can dedicate to just watching RSS feeds and watching the news and tracking all the different locations to see what tax holidays are expiring and what cities you're operating in and things like that. So it's a very intense process if you're really trying to capture all the data. And there are several ways that you can monitor that data to make it less stressful. You could hire an internal person to do it and do the analysis, find all that data and make decisions. You could use software, right, or a service like Neo's in terms of collecting all of it. You could actually use a consultant to do regular assessments. It wouldn't necessarily be real-time, but certainly for most purposes, a quarterly assessment is something that I know some of you do, and that several consultants actually have practices in. So when you think about monitoring, there's not one right way to do it. There are several ways to do it, and depending on your resources, you may even combine some of these together as you're building your risk model and you're building your risk program. So the important part is that as you're capturing all this data, right, from all these geographies and everything that affects your suppliers, each new event gets incorporated into the risk tracking, and if it has some kind of an impact, if it's a low impact event, it may not change any of your risk scores. If it's a medium impact or a high impact, it will definitely change the risk scores. So the point is not to take the data in and of itself as like a particular action item. It's to incorporate it into the model, see how it changes the supplier's risk, and then take an action based on that. But you really need to be monitoring continuously to be effective at your risk management. So we've been talking about the different risk categories and some of the things you could track. And these are just some sample trigger events again. So when you're thinking about collecting data, these might be the things that you're looking for, right? So among your suppliers, you might be looking for their financial status, right? We talked about all the different factors there, but things like revenue, profitability, quarter over quarter, employee attrition. I know certainly for those of you who use a lot of global delivery providers, that's a big issue, right? What does the attrition rate look like for your supplier, and is it better or worse than what its competitors are doing, and how might that affect your service delivery? Right? Are there any significant partnerships? What kind of intellectual property filings do they have? Are there any company-specific job actions that you have to worry about relative to your supplier? And then similarly, on the geography side, you would worry about a country or a city's credit rating, changes in their budget, tax changes, because a lot of times, again, anything that affects your supplier would affect you. So if a tax holiday expires in one particular city and your supplier now has to pay higher taxes, a lot of times, obviously, that comes back to them wanting to, in the next renegotiation, charge higher rates. So you have to kind of think about things like that, geopolitical events, etc. So again, as you're thinking about monitoring data, when we're saying monitor continuously, what kinds of things are you looking for? And these are some of the things that you would be looking for to track and to enter into your database so that you can get your risk score. So, I said this at the beginning, but it's worth repeating here. If you plan to do nothing with the data, don't bother to collect the data. Right? One of the things that I hear most often from clients is, Christine, I get all these alerts. I subscribe to different news services, and I see all these things, but what exactly do you expect me to do with all these red flags? Like, all I keep doing is getting all these notes about these scary things that are happening, and this happened in this country, and this happened to the supplier, and all these things. Okay, they've got lower attrition than their competitors, or their attrition is rising. What do you want me to do about that? Right? What does this actually mean? That's where the action plan becomes critical here, right? So all of the monitoring, all of the risk definition, everything up to this point is actually useless if you don't have a plan of how to address risks. So most people, when they talk about addressing risks, talk about reducing risk, right? They talk about getting risk as close to zero as possible. That's somewhat unrealistic, right? Zero risk is not possible, right? Getting it close to zero may not even be that attractive given the opportunity cost of things that you could be doing with a slightly higher risk profile. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't worry about risk at all because risk happens. There are actually several standards, including ISO and some others, that include risk management as part of their framework. So they're actually, if you read some of those, and I don't know if I should admit this or not, but I have read them, there are actually several common ways to address a risk, right? So if you think about a risk increasing or decreasing, and again, if you've defined your risk, you know what indicators you're looking for, and you know at what point you want to do something, right? Like again, maybe if I'm tracking financial risk and I see 3/4 of losses, then I'm going to call my account manager in and say, okay, tell me what you're going to do to get out of this, because I don't want to be 2 more quarters into this and find out that you're doing a layoff and it affects my delivery, right? We need to make sure that we're keeping on top of those things, as an example. So the most common ways to address a risk include avoiding the risk completely. So from a supplier risk standpoint, that might mean the decision to not hire a supplier at all, or to remove that supplier from your supply base if the risk was really serious enough, or it was a risk that you just couldn't tolerate, right? So maybe the supplier is actually generally considered stable, but maybe there's just a particular risk that you're worried about that you just can't. Maybe the supplier is actually very good at what they do, so the delivery risk is okay, but you're so worried about compliance risk that the supplier is somebody you want to work with. That's the kind of thing that you would avoid the risk completely. You could reduce the risk, so that could be anything from making sure you have a better governance process in place with a supplier to avoid any surprises. It could be taking some business away from a supplier that you might feel is getting riskier and giving it to somebody else in your supply base so that you're still using that supplier, but you're reducing your dependence on them. That would be an example of reducing the risk. You can accept the risk, right? You can say to yourself, I'll never get to zero risk. The supplier might be a little bit risky, but because we've compared all of our suppliers, we know that they're not any more risky than one of the other suppliers in our stable, so therefore we accept the risk. So we're going to renew that contract, or we are going to keep things at a steady state because we're comfortable with the risk as it stands. Or, and this is where you start to get into that take advantage of opportunities phase, you could increase the risk. Right? You could see, for example, a situation where you could expand scope with a supplier because you want to increase the value that you receive from that supplier. So maybe there's a supplier that's risky, but there's a business opportunity that's just so great that you really choose to increase your risk. So good examples of those kinds of things are boutique startup companies that have really great technology that can help your business move forward. Right? Most of us I know who come out of sourcing backgrounds, for example, tend to have pretty tight definitions of what kinds of suppliers we're working with. And generally speaking, startups don't fall into the stable category, so a lot of us try to avoid the startups. But again, if you are trying to get a leg up in your industry and you're trying to get ahead of your competitors and you see a startup with a really cool technology that you want to take advantage of, you may increase your risk by working with that supplier that, again, under traditional models you might decide is risky. But it's worth it because the return on that risk is so great. Right? So that's actually, again, a really important point I want you to walk away with here. Is like, yes, you want to avoid bad things, but there are actually a lot of really great business advantages you could pursue if you understood risk management, right? The only reason that you could, I think, be successful in working with that boutique, let's say, using that example, continuing that, is that you know what risk you're taking and you know why you're taking it. Most people will tell you that the most dangerous risks are the ones you don't know you're taking. So if you had a good supplier risk management program and you knew what would happen, what you would do if one of those risks actually occurred, it would give you enough confidence to move forward and take smart risks. So avoid the dumb risks, take the smart risks, because those are the ones that are going to help you move your business forward. So that's what the action plan really should be when you're thinking about it. Like, how am I going to address these risks so that I reduce the unnecessary risks, but I increase the smart risks where they're really going to pay off for me. Right? So as part of that, right, what does it mean kind of on a more nuts and bolts basis to take action on the risks? So you've got your risk definition, you're watching the trigger events, and you, let's say, see a risk rising. You have to have a statement of what you're going to do if that risk happens. So again, 3/4 of bad financial statements, the action is call in the account manager and see if you feel comfortable with the provider's approach to getting itself out of that financial position. So think about it as a set of if-then statements. If this happens, we will do that. It's very important to build the action plan before any of these risks actually happen, because generally, what we find is that clients become so embroiled in, what we say like the fog of war, right? That in the middle of it, it's very often kind of an emotional thing, and the risk seems much higher because it just happened, right? And so things seem like a lot more panicky. So if you are able to build your action plan in advance, then it takes away that kind of emotional reaction. And you can make a smarter decision, because if a risk happens, you can say, all right, we know what we're going to do here because we've already got our plan in place. And again, this is the kind of thing that you don't have to work on alone, because a lot of risk teams and a lot of compliance teams have similar ways to address risk. So not that you're going to use all of their approaches, but you can actually work with that team to build out an action plan that will work for you. And it doesn't have to be complicated. It just needs to be usable so that for all the risks that you're tracking. And again, here are some tactical examples. So we talked about the supplier and the financial risks, right? But what about the second one? If a supplier that we're using loses customers in our industry, we'll call and ask about deploying newly available resources to our account. Okay. So I know some of you might look at that and say, oh, the supplier is losing accounts. That might mean there could be a service disruption. It could be, but again, maybe they only lost one account, right? The thing is, like, where's the real risk and where's the real opportunity there? And in this case, if the supplier is losing a couple of small accounts, or maybe they're losing one account that actually was a banner account for them, maybe the A resources were deployed on that account, and maybe you want something from that account. I actually had a client a few years ago who did this in the chemicals industry. Realized it was in 2008, right when the banking crisis was happening. If you guys remember that, right before the Great Recession, or it was like right at the beginning of the Great Recession. So it would have been like the fall of 2008. And even though this was a chemicals company, their outsourcer was losing a lot of financial services clients, right? Because all the banks weren't doing well. And this client actually turned around and said, you know what, I'm a huge client, so I know that no matter what else happens, they're going to take care of me. I'm not worried about service disruptions because they're, losing clients. I am worried. I am going to take this as an opportunity to take advantage. And they called up the outsourcer and they said, we know that there's a lot of analytics that happens in banks, and we want some of your analytics resources in our account. So we want to swap out some of the people we have for some of the resources that we're working at the banks. So on the one hand, a pretty tactical move, but on the other hand, something that the supplier was, in that instance, very willing to do, because here was a client that was using a specific event and a specific risk to negotiate. So not to just sort of say, oh, I want this, but to actually be able to pull all the pieces together. So the supplier was more willing than they might normally have been to do something like that. And the client got an advantage out of that. The client was able to swap out resources for the same rate, but get better resources. And so, again, think about supplier risk management not as just avoiding bad, which would be the first example, but to take advantage and to get something good for your organization on the other side. So it's worth noting that up until this point, I've been talking mostly about the suppliers and what kinds of risks they face and what kind of risks you should be tracking for them. I do want to also tell you it's worthwhile for you to think about your own risk tolerance. Because again, just like not all risks are equal, not all clients and customers value the same risk profiles. Right? If you come from a very conservative company, then your tolerance for risk may be much lower than somebody who comes from a more aggressive company. Similarly, if you don't have a lot of governance capabilities, and I know that a lot of companies don't right now, then you tend to be less risky, less open to risk because you don't have the internal capabilities to manage all the suppliers all the time. For those of you who have really good and mature vendor governance capabilities, I've seen that those kinds of companies like to take more risks because they can, because they know what kinds of questions to ask the supplier, they know how to manage that relationship, and therefore they have higher tolerance for risk in certain areas. So you have to ask yourself, what risks are you willing to accept? Again, you'll never get it down to zero, but what kinds of risks are you willing to accept if you thought about all of the different risk categories we talked about earlier? Your supplier risk tolerance needs to match your overall risk appetite. Again, conservative companies tend to have lower risk tolerance. I've not seen a company ever successfully take a high-risk supplier approach when generally they're a low-risk tolerance company in general. Just tends not to work that way. Even though sometimes they had very good business reasons for wanting to take that approach, I've not ever really seen it pay off for them. So your supplier risk tolerance really has to match your overall company culture on risk. Generally, risk tolerance decreases when scope, spend, or data access increase. So I know if you were to talk to your, say, IT security people, they would tell you any supplier that touches data is a high-risk supplier. Right? Any supplier that is an enterprise supplier or classified as a tier 1 supplier, your tolerance for risk in those suppliers may be much lower than your tolerance for an application development company in Ukraine or Mexico that has like 5 people that you're working with, and if you had to, you could swap out suppliers pretty quickly from them. So risk tolerance can also intentionally be raised. So as you're working on things, you can increase your risk tolerance by being able to improve your internal governance, by improving your oversight, and by thinking about the transparency and the access data that you're giving to everyone. So let me show you a sample risk assessment. And again, I told you earlier that NEO uses a particular model. So you can see our category scores for a supplier down the first column here under the categories. And you can see that we've tracked 5 suppliers here. And then in NEO's model, we actually classify a best-in-class score. So what's really important here is if you think about your suppliers, right, let's look at the bottom one, thought leadership. So 1 is the best that anybody has gotten, and that's supplier 2. But nobody's really that far off. Everybody's pretty green in that. Supplier 4 seems to be going a little bit lower. They actually dropped from a 1.4 to a 2.6. But generally, everybody's okay, and they're pretty in line with what the best in class is. Similarly, if you look at financial, everybody's yellow, right, which is moderate risk. So if you think about that, if you were only looking at one supplier, you'd be like, wow, they're kind of risky. They're yellow. They're not green. But then if you actually look at the best in class score is actually moderate. So it's a good way for you to cross-check and balance across what you're seeing. Because sometimes if you look at just a supplier in isolation, you might think that they are riskier than they really are. Because again, in this particular category, all the suppliers are roughly in the band of what the best in class is with the 4.42. So that means even if you were working with one of these suppliers, if you looked at it independently, you might say, gee, they're riskier than the rest of the market, but in fact they're not. Now, on the other hand, if you look at people, you'll see there's actually a lot of variance there. Right? The best in class is a 3.95, but you see that supplier 4 is actually in the red category. So that's actually something that's pretty important to think about there in terms of, okay, that supplier has high attrition, and it's not because the market has high attrition. They actually are higher than what the best in class category score is for that. So that would be something that would warrant a deeper conversation. So again, a sample for you to kind of take a look at, and also to show you the importance of not just tracking individual suppliers, but scoring them in comparison to each other so that you can see a really true picture of your overall supply base and also how your supplier fits against the market average. And finally, I want to come back to this idea of gaining advantage, because it's very easy to say that. Right? Of course, we always talk about gaining competitive advantage, sustainable advantage, all those kinds of things. But I want you to think about this from a very practical standpoint. Right? When I'm saying you can gain competitive advantage, I'm not saying that as sort of a theoretical statement or an aspirational statement. I am telling you that that is something that you can actually do. That it's not just about insuring yourself against bad things that are happening, but if you have an action plan, if you know what you will do when the bad things happen, you will actually also know what to do if there's an opportunity to increase your risk to make something good happen for your company. So the action plan is really what's going to give you the power to move forward with confidence. Clear risk management and action plans help you build that confidence. It helps you build confidence not just for yourself and for your team, but with your internal and external constituents. So if you actually start to think about everybody who cares about your suppliers, in the examples we were giving earlier about your customers, we see a lot that customers care more and more about who your suppliers are, and if your supply base has things like conflict minerals in it. That is a compliance issue, but it's actually also an issue for a lot of people who want to do ethical purchases, right? They want to buy from companies that they feel are ethical and support the same values that they do. So your customers will care a lot about this. Your auditors care about this, of course. Your board of directors will care about your suppliers. But having the clear risk management plan makes sure that you don't get caught off guard by what I'm terming surprise supplier events. Very often these surprises aren't actually surprises if you were tracking them, right? So the risk industry talks a lot about black swan events that can't be foreseen. There really aren't as many of those as you would think, right? And there's actually a reason that they call them black swans to begin with. But don't let yourself get lulled into the idea of things can't be predicted, right? If you start to track these things over time, you'll find the patterns, and it'll give you the confidence to move forward. And that confidence will translate into higher confidence from your investors, from your customers, and from your key executive stakeholders internally. So again, the real message I want you to take away here is that using risk management to gain competitive advantage is a very practical thing that you really can do today. It's not a theoretical for us. It really is something that you can do, and I think that's the important thing for you to remember. Yes, you want to protect yourself. You want to insure against bad things happening, but really good risk management is about making your business better and stronger and getting advantage for yourself so you can take advantage of opportunities that are going forward. So with that, I am going to take a break and open up for questions. And Laurence, I'm going to ask you to come back online with me and see if there are any questions that the audience had.
Hi everybody, this is Laurence again. We have had several questions from the audience about getting a copy of the slide deck and the recording, and I just want to repeat and say that yes, absolutely, I will be sharing both the recording of this session and the slide deck soon after this session. So no worries about missing some key bits of information on previous slides. It will be shared. And then as we wait for for everybody to type in their questions, or just a reminder, all you have to do is click on that question box within your control panel. It either says questions or it's a question mark, and then you type it in just like a regular chat box that we're all so familiar with nowadays. All right, and we do have one question. Mm-hmm. And it says, how did you come up with the score on slide 20? And so my assumption would be that that's our portfolio overview slide.
Yeah, I will actually move back. So this is the slide that the question was asked about. So how do we come up with these scores? So NEO uses a model just like we proposed for all of you to use in our Supply Wisdom product that tracks the categories of risks that I showed you earlier in the slides, right? You'll remember the supplier risks and the location risks. This is a supplier assessment here. So we track these 8 categories down the first column, and we assign weight to each category, and then within each category there are several sub-criteria that we follow in that category, and each of those also gets a weight and a score, and then we roll that up and do the calculation on that. So it's actually an algorithm that we can't actually share in greater detail, but I can tell you that's roughly how the model works, and actually something that you could build yourself in terms of, I wouldn't say it's easy to build yourself, of course, but it is actually possible to just create an algorithm that works like ours, or an algorithm that suits you better. But that's how we do that. We assign a numerical score to each of the risk events and the risk indicators to get our category scores, and then that all rolls up to our total risk score. And the best in class is not an average. The best in class is the supplier with the least risky score in a particular category. So you're comparing against the top performer. You're comparing your suppliers against the top performer in a category, whether or not you actually are using that top performer, I should specify. So, in some cases you'll see, look, the top one, the best in class, is a 3.04. That's actually regardless of these 5, right? We actually track several hundred suppliers, so that best in class is actually across all the suppliers we track.
I think that's a great explanation, and if anybody wants a deeper look into the risk model itself, reach out to us and we can follow up with a one-on-one and take you through some specific examples, because as Christine mentioned, we do track hundreds of parameters. So for each country, for each city, for each supplier, we track over 350 parameters, and each of those is assigned a risk score. So I don't want to repeat too much, but it's a very complex, wonderful algorithm that our research team has worked on and perfected over many, many, many years. So, if we could turn to the next question. Mm-hmm. Christine, here's a question. It's, what tool software would you suggest that companies evaluate for use to help them execute a successful third-party oversight function? And the question expands on which tools can help with the execution of several dimensions of third-party oversight, including risk management, performance management, financial management, client satisfaction management, etc.
So this is a huge question because there are a lot of suppliers in this space. And even just in the risk space, when I was talking about it earlier, there are software vendors who do risk monitoring and risk tracking. There are consulting firms that do it. There are often a lot of different ways to do that. If I thought about the broader category of third-party oversight, and to your point that you expanded on some of the issues, like tracking the risks, but tracking their actual performance for you, tracking other issues that you might have in that area, there are actually several classes of vendors. Right? So, for example, you could start with sourcing category. Right? So you could think about e-procurement tools, and you could think about contract lifecycle management. Those normally have some capability to track supplier performance. And they're starting to get into the supplier risk space too. Right? I mean, you'd have to decide if you want to do a suite or a set of point solutions, but the e-sourcing and the contract lifecycle management do have this performance and oversight category to it. There is a whole category of vendor management tools and supplier performance that you could go after. There are tools that track SLAs. There are tools that track governance, risk, and compliance as their own category, for example, and most of those include third-party categories now. So you could include third-party risk as part of your governance, risk, and compliance. So it's such a broad question, I feel like I'm not really doing it justice, but I would say that there's probably a chance if you use some sourcing software or if you've used one of the supplier risk vendors, and if you actually search on supplier risk software, you can find some of them, or the governance, risk, and compliance vendors, you'll start to see that those any one of those pieces could start you on your journey, and then you find point solutions to fill in the other pieces that you're missing.
I think that gives a good overview, Christine. Maybe we can close it out, Christine, with one last kind of general question that we've had from a lot of our clients is, you've talked a lot about the important points to consider with a third-party oversight program. What would be your #1 suggestion on how to go from theory to action, or how to make this practical, hands-on, as we step away from this webinar? What should be our first action step on our to-do list?
So a very practical thing that you could do, and again, if you were sort of like looking at all of this and say, I don't even know where I would start, I would say the first thing to do is to talk to your compliance team internally and to see what kind of models they're using. Because again, they may not be tracking supplier risks, but I can assure you that they are tracking risks to your own business, right? What's the risk that you can't get access to capital if you need it? What's the risk that you can't operate your business, right, because you've had a failure somewhere along the line? And from those corporate risks, they can tell you what kinds of things to look for, and it at least would give you a framework for starting to think about this. And then from there, I would start to look at what risks affect my corporate operations. Right? So that's where the chain starts. Right? What's my business worried about? And usually you can get that from your auditors or your compliance team. And then you start to say, okay, does my supplier increase or decrease this risk? If you're a very small company and you don't have a great data security team, you might find that actually using an outsourcer increases your security program, right? So in fact, it actually decreases the risk that you're going to get hacked because your supplier has better capabilities than you do in that area. So suppliers don't always increase your risk. Sometimes they can decrease it. So I would start there and then let it waterfall down.
Great. So thanks everyone for joining us today. We are at the top of the hour, so I want to let everyone know one more time, everything is being recorded and it will be shared shortly here after this session. I have one more question from one of our attendees. So Christine, if your schedule permits and you have a moment to answer live, that would be wonderful. And for everyone else, if you've got to hop off again, we'll continue to record and we'll share here very shortly. So the last question we'll take today is, do you all recommend global providers to track SLAs, and then we ourselves track SLAs or metrics to validate?
So is it worth tracking from both sides, if I understand the question? Like, can you hire somebody to track SLAs and then separately track them yourself? Did I understand that correctly?
That's how I interpret the question as well.
It is possible to do that. Easier to do that in some instances than others. So if it's a highly automated service, right, it's not that hard to track SLAs, say, for example, uptime and availability of servers and things like that, because you can find a piece of software that will just monitor your traffic and be able to tell you those kinds of things. And then you could also track that separately yourself. A lot of outsourcers, for example, actually have portals that you can use to get in to do that. And if you didn't want to use the outsourcer, you could hire a third party to do that for you and then track it on your own. So it is possible, certainly, to do that. It's pretty common to do that in some categories. In other categories, I think it depends. Like, for example, if you're looking at a service, very often you can track things like, say, a BPO that is doing your accounting, and it's pretty easy to track the speed and the accuracy with which they're delivering, and maybe a little bit harder to track things like how good is their account management team, but certainly possible. I think in most cases, clients want to track it themselves, even if they have the third party, because they want to feel like they've got their own data and they're not being held hostage to somebody else's version of what's going on.
That's great. I think that's a great answer, and we did get clarity from the attendee that this was the question, and you've answered it very well.
Thank you.
So thanks again, everyone, for joining us today, and thank you, Christine, for your time and your insights on this topic. Like you said, it's a really hot topic, and it's a great one to keep top of mind as we kick off 2015. So without, unless you have any final closing thoughts, Christine, I think we're all set.
We are. I just want to thank everybody for joining, and you see that there are some emails and phone numbers here. Mine is at the top, so if you come up with a question later that you didn't get a chance to ask, please feel free to drop me or Casey or Bill a note, and we'd be happy to answer that for you. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, Christine, and thanks, everyone. Take care.